Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. We are diving headfirst today into well, the whole mess in Ukraine and Russia.
It's a real,
Yeah, it's a real not to untangle
go
around.
to not.
We are going to be focusing on the potential for, well, any kind of international negotiations to, hopefully lead to some kind of peace. We've got two main sources that we're going to be leaning on here today. We've got some analysis from General Sir Richard Shirreff. He's a former NATO deputy, Supreme Allied Commander.
So heavy hitter.
Yeah, exactly. Real insider perspective. And then we've also got a report straight from the ground in Kyiv from Will Lloyd. He's a journalist.
So we have the view from NATO and the view from, well, from the middle of it all.
Right, exactly. And our goal for this deep dive is, well, it's threefold, really.
Yeah.
We're going to try to answer how likely is a peaceful resolution, through some kind of negotiation right now.
Yeah.
That's the first one. Second, what are the big differences in how Russia, Ukraine, and the whole international community, especially the U.S., how do they all see this conflict playing out? And then finally, what could this all mean in the long run? What are the long-term consequences?
Big questions.
Yeah, really big questions. So where do we even begin?
Well, I think it's,
I mean, there's so many moving parts.
right. To understand where we might go, we have to understand the perspectives of, well, of the players involved.
Okay, yeah, let's do that. Let's start with Russia. General Shirreff, he doesn't mince words, He says that Putin might be sitting at the negotiating table, making it seem like he wants to talk.
Yeah.
But he's doing it from a position he sees as, well, weakness. Right. And even more importantly, Shirreff says Putin's main goal, like his big objective, hasn't changed at all.
Yeah.
He still wants to control all of Ukraine.
And possibly even, go further than that. He kind of hints at, Putin's desire to maybe rebuild a whole Russian empire, doesn't he?
Yeah, exactly. He implies that this is, this isn't just about Ukraine for Putin. It's about something, well, much bigger.
And that's where the historical context that Sheriff talks about becomes so important, right? He
Yeah.
talks about how deeply ingrained this belief is in Russia that they can't, like, they literally cannot be a true empire without having control over Ukraine. So it's
Almost like an obsession.
yeah, and it explains why they're so, so dug in on this. For them, it's not just about taking over land, it's about fulfilling some kind of historical destiny.
So if you're listening and you're thinking, okay, so what about a ceasefire? Could that work? Well, Shirreff's pretty blunt about it.
Yeah.
He basically says, don't trust it.
He really does.
Yeah. He says we should just assume that Putin's going to break any agreement, any ceasefire, if it doesn't give him everything he wants.
It's kind of a pessimistic outlook.
Yeah, it is. It doesn't, inspire a lot of hope for some kind of quick peace deal.
And the only way Shirreff sees Russia genuinely considering peace, it's if they suffer a major military defeat, like a big one.
So essentially, they have to be forced into it.
It seems that way. And that's important for understanding Russia's perspective. This isn't just some political squabble to them. This is about, well, it's about power. It's about strength on the battlefield.
Which reminds me, Shirreff brought up peacekeeping forces, and it's,
It's a thorny issue.
Right, yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Because he points out that Russia has already said, flat out, that they will not accept any Western peacekeepers on Ukrainian soil. So, I mean, how do you even begin to, imagine a peaceful solution when one side is so completely against a core part of any peacekeeping effort?
Yeah, it raises this huge question about how effective any peace agreement could be, if it's imposed from the outside, especially when you have a major player like Russia just, rejecting outright a key element that's usually seen as crucial for creating stability, like an impartial peacekeeping force.
Right, exactly. Okay, so we've talked about Russia's perspective. Let's move over to the United States and talk about, well, Trump and his possible involvement. Shirreff is pretty critical of Trump's approach.
Yeah, to say the least.
Yeah. He suggests that Putin's basically playing Trump, like using him, and that Trump maybe doesn't fully understand Putin's real goals. And those goals are long-term, like way down the line.
It's it's a bit of a worrying thought. It makes you think about all the stuff going on behind the scenes in international relations and how important it is to really, really understand the motivations of the people you're dealing with. You can't just waltz in and cut deals without understanding what they really want.
Right, and it makes you wonder if maybe Trump's negotiating from a position of weakness, as Shirreff suggests.
Yeah, and if that's the case, then it really complicates the the potential for a strong U.S.-led negotiation.
Absolutely. And, it gets even more complicated when you think about what Sheriff says about how the U.S. could have approached this whole thing differently. He suggests, and this is pretty stark, that the only way for the U.S. to have really negotiated from a position of strength would have been to give Ukraine enough military support to actually defeat Russia.
That's a pretty bold statement.
Yeah, it is. And he even goes as far as to say that it might be too late for that now.
So it's like he's arguing that there was this window of opportunity and that a stronger commitment to Ukraine's military early on, way back, could have completely changed how these negotiations are happening now.
Right. And he's basically suggesting that, well, maybe that window's closed.
Yeah, food for thought.
Yeah, it definitely makes you think. And then, we have to bring in what Will Lloyd is reporting from Kiev. He points out that some of the things Trump's been saying lately, like publicly, are really, really concerning.
Like what specifically?
Well, Lloyd mentions that Trump recently said that Ukrainian forces are surrounded in Kharkiv. But that's completely contradicted by what Lloyd's actually seeing and hearing on the ground, And what's even more alarming is that this idea, that Ukrainian troops are surrounded, it's the same narrative that Russian propaganda is pushing.
That's not good. It makes you wonder where Trump is getting his information from, It also really makes you question the kind of narratives that are being promoted by world leaders, especially when you see a potential future negotiator repeating something that sounds like straight up disinformation from the opposing side in a conflict.
It undermines everything.
It really does. It creates this massive trust problem. And for Ukraine, it must be really concerning, I mean, they're relying on international partners for support, but if those partners are echoing, the enemy's propaganda, then it really throws everything into question.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of brings us full circle to Ukraine's position in all of this. Despite all this external pressure, they're holding strong. Their core demands, their red lines haven't changed. They are determined to remain a sovereign nation.
Which is totally understandable. I mean, as Lloyd makes clear, this isn't some abstract political game for them. This is about their survival. It's about their right to exist as a nation with their own identity, their own future.
And Lloyd's report, it really lays bare just how brutal and constant this conflict is.
Yeah.
He mentions that in just the day before he filed his report, Kiev was hit by 2 ballistic missiles. And get this, 178 drone attacks in one day. That really gives you a sense of the level of threat that Ukrainians are living under every single day. And it makes you realize that while diplomats might be talking, in some fancy conference room somewhere, the fighting and the dying is still happening, right now in Ukraine.
And that has to affect their ability, even their willingness to think about long-term peace negotiations. How can you even think about that when you're constantly under attack?
Right. It's hard to, plan for the future when you're just trying to survive the present.
Exactly.
Lloyd also gives us a glimpse into what's happening on the ground in Kiev, socially. He talks about this National Day of Volunteers parade.
Yeah.
And he describes the young people marching as looking like miniature paramilitaries. He points out that there's been this real shift in public opinion towards these groups, the ones who are willing to fight. At first, they were kind of controversial, but Lloyd says that now a lot of civilians see them as representing the future of Ukraine. And that tells you a lot about how the war has changed Ukrainian society, Ukrainian identity.
It's interesting, Lloyd gives some context about why those volunteer groups were initially controversial. And it just highlights how when a country faces such an existential threat, everything changes. Priorities shift, and how people view different parts of their society can completely transform. A group that might have been seen as fringe or radical in peacetime can become, heroes when everyone feels like their very existence is on the line.
Yeah, absolutely. So thinking about these negotiations, what leverage does Ukraine have? Well, Lloyd mentions that they initially wanted to hold on to territory near Kharkiv as a bargaining chip. But, the situation has changed. It looks like Russian forces have pushed Ukrainian troops back to these prepared defensive lines, trenches, bunkers, that kind of thing. So the battlefield situation is shifting, and that will likely affect Ukraine's leverage in any potential talks.
It really goes to show you that war is fluid, it's unpredictable, you can plan and strategize all you want, but what happens on the battlefield directly impacts what happens at the negotiating table. Ukraine's tactical shift to, more defensive positions there suggests that they're prioritizing holding the line in that region, and that could change how they approach negotiations.
Definitely. Okay, so let's talk about Europe now, specifically this idea of a coalition of the willing.
Okay.
There's been a lot of chatter about, a European-led security guarantee for Ukraine. And to give you an idea of just how big of a commitment they're talking about, the estimated cost would require participating nations to spend 3.5% of their defense budgets for 10 years straight.
That's a big ask.
Yeah, it's a huge ask. And it really shows you that Europe's starting to realize that this conflict isn't just some temporary problem. It has real long-term security implications for them.
Especially if the U.S. under Trump, if they're seen as less reliable in terms of security guarantees, Europe might feel like they have to step up, even if they can't fully replace the U.S. right away.
Right, exactly. But, as Shirreff points out, there's a big catch with this whole European peacekeeping force idea. It might not even matter unless there's a ceasefire agreement in place first.
Makes sense. I mean, you can't really keep the peace if there's no peace to keep.
Yeah, it's kind of a chicken and egg situation.
Yeah.
And then both Shirreff and Lloyd, they both bring up this concern about, how long would any peacekeeping mission have to last?
Yeah, how long would they have to commit?
Shirreff's pretty clear. He says it could be decades. Like, we could be talking about a peacekeeping force in Ukraine for decades until Russia finally accepts that Ukraine is an independent country.
So it's not just about stopping the immediate fighting. It's about creating a situation where Russia won't just, turn around and invade again in 5, 10, 20 years.
Right. And Lloyd's report kind of echoes that, he talks about all these international summits and discussions that are happening. But he also points out that there haven't been any concrete results that directly address the immediate problems in Ukraine.
Right. Like, all this talk is great, but what about the fighting that's happening right now in the Donbass? What about the need for better air defense systems? Those are immediate life or death issues.
Yeah, exactly. And it kind of feels like there's this disconnect between the high-level diplomatic stuff and the reality on the ground.
It can be frustrating, for sure.
Yeah, especially for the people living in Ukraine.
Yeah.
They don't have the luxury of waiting for years while diplomats hash things out. So Shirreff argues that, all this talk of a coalition of the willing might be the best leverage that the international community has right now.
Yeah.
Especially with all the uncertainty around what U.S. security guarantees would look like, if Trump gets back in office.
Right. And it's interesting because it's almost like this coalition is being seen as a backup plan. If the U.S. isn't going to be a reliable security partner anymore, then Europe needs to figure out how to do it themselves. And that's a huge shift in global power dynamics.
It really is. And then there's this fear, and Lloyd touches on this in his report, that any kind of peace deal, if it doesn't have really strong, really believable security guarantees, could end up leaving Ukraine extremely vulnerable to another Russian attack down the road.
So it's not just about, getting Russia to agree to stop fighting right now. It's about making sure they don't just decide to attack again later.
Right. It's about long-term security. And the concern is that, even if there's a pause in the fighting, it doesn't mean there's going to be a lasting peace.
Yeah, and that's why the specific terms of any peace deal are so important. If they don't address Ukraine's security concerns, if there aren't real verifiable guarantees for their future, then it could just be a temporary fix. And that just sets the stage for the whole cycle to start all over again.
So let's recap. We've covered a lot here, but the big takeaway from all of this, the thing for you, our listener, to really understand is this. We're dealing with a super complex situation, and there are huge differences of opinion on how to move forward. Negotiating with Russia, well, that's going to be a challenge, especially given their perceived long-term goals. And then you add in all the uncertainty around what U.S. foreign policy is going to look like, and it just becomes, it becomes a real mess. And it's all happening while Ukraine's very existence is hanging in the balance. This whole thing has implications not just for Ukraine, but for the security of all of Europe.
You hit the nail on the head. This deep dive, it really highlights these massive choices facing the international community right now. There aren't any easy solutions, and the decisions made in the next few years are going to have ripple effects for a long, long time.
Right, exactly. So that brings us to our final thought, something for you, our listener, to ponder. After hearing all this, what do you think is the most likely outcome here? What's the most likely path this conflict is going to take in the months and years ahead? And what role should different countries play in shaping that outcome? We really want you to think about the long-term consequences of all the different approaches that are being debated. Because, there are no easy answers here.
Nope, not at all.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a lot to process.
Yeah, a lot to process.
But we hope it's given you some food for thought.
Absolutely.
All right, we'll see you next time.
See you.